This video takes the IPCC, World Economic Forum, and United Nations hypothesis that the greenhouse gases carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane are causing global warming, and compares it with the experience of the past 10,000 years. Does the hypothesis agree with the experience of the past 10,000 years? Carbon dioxide is a trace gas measured in parts per million of the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide is a trace gas measured in parts per billion of the atmosphere. Methane is a trace gas measured in parts per billion of the atmosphere. Yet, these so-called greenhouse gases are the underlying cause of much social change and unrest. A few examples. Farmers are protesting in Italy over the government-enforced slaughter of 140,000 head of cattle in order to reduce methane emissions. For the same reason, the government of Ireland is considering a €2 billion retirement scheme to meet climate targets. Farmers in Germany and Holland are protesting proposals to cut the emissions of nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide reduction lies behind the United Nations calling for an end to global coal projects. All this comes about because of a hypothesis that says when the atmospheric concentrations of the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane increase, then this causes global average temperature to increase. The first IPCC report in 1990 started a series of events that formalized this hypothesis. It explained that there is concern that human activities may be inadvertently changing the climate of the globe through the enhanced greenhouse effect by past and continuing emissions of carbon dioxide and other gases, which will cause the temperature of the Earth's surface to increase, popularly termed the global warming. It highlights the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane. Moving forward to 2015, the Paris Agreement and United Nations 2030 Agenda called for a worldwide reduction in the emissions of those gases, which they said would transform our world. But despite 196 nations signing up to the Paris Agreement, carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration from 2015 to 2019 continued to rise, as did the concentration of nitrous oxide, and so too methane. Faced with this failure, Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum met with Antonio Guterres of the United Nations and made a pact to accelerate the implementation of Agenda 2030. What authority they had to do this is unclear. Things came to a head in 2021 with the publication of the latest IPCC report, The Physical Science Basis. The report insisted that the observed increases in well-mixed greenhouse gas concentrations since around 1750 are unequivocally caused by human activities, and that since 2011 concentrations have continued to increase in the atmosphere, reaching annual averages of 410 parts per million for carbon dioxide, 1,866 parts per billion for methane, and 332 parts per billion for nitrous oxide. It issued the warning that unless there are deep reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions, the goal of limiting warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and close to 1.5 degrees Celsius will be out of reach. The report warned that United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has stated that the evidence is irrefutable, and there we come to an issue. What exactly is the evidence for the global warming and greenhouse gas hypothesis? What is the confidence we, the general public and the politicians we voted for, what is the confidence we can have in that hypothesis? We will now pursue that issue. The method adopted will be to compare the hypothesis with experience. The method is based on the IPCC statement of fact that today many decisions remain grounded in the experience of past climate variability. The method is also based on the scientific method brilliantly described by Nobel laureate Richard Feynman. In general, he says, we look for a new law by the following process. First, we guess or hypothesize it, and then we compare the guess or hypothesis to nature. We compare it to experiment or experience to see if it works. If it disagrees with experiment or experience, it's wrong. In that simple statement is the key to science. If the hypothesis disagrees with experiment or experience, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. We now set about comparing the global warming and greenhouse gas hypothesis with the experience of the past 10,000 years. We will start 10,000 years ago at 8,000 BCE. But first, for only 2 minutes or so, we need to broadly describe how the climate had changed prior to that time. For the past 800,000 years, the climate has swung through cold glacial periods and warmer interglacial periods. The 4 most recent warm interglacial periods have all been warmer than the average of the past 1,000 years, shown by the red dotted line. The warmest of all was the last interglacial, around 125,000 years ago. It was at least as warm as the 10-year period 2011 to 2020, and for a much longer time, at approximately 128,000 years ago, East Antarctic ice cores show early peak temperatures approximately 5 degrees Celsius above the present, and high latitude surface temperature averaged over several thousand years was at least 2 degrees Celsius warmer than present. We can zoom in on what happened next from that high point. Global average temperature decreased through a series of peaks and troughs until it reached the last glacial maximum, which was the coldest point of the past 800,000 years. After thousands of freezing years, global temperature began to rise. Then a strange thing happened. Global temperature dropped sharply and remained that way for around 1,000 years. This is known as the Younger Dryas event. Something perhaps even stranger happened next. Global temperature very sharply increased. That warming phase that took place about 11,500 years ago at the end of the Younger Dryas was also very abrupt, and central Greenland temperatures increased by 7 degrees Celsius or more in a few decades. We now arrive at the beginning of our present warm interglacial period, the Holocene. To cover the Holocene up until the modern climate recording period at 1850, we used the Kaufman et al. Data. This is the most comprehensive global Holocene proxy temperature time series currently available. It was published as recently as 2020. This chart shows Holocene global mean surface temperature anomalies from around 10,000 BCE to 1850 CE. Following the sharp rise after the Younger Dryas, global temperature continued to rise in a more sedate manner until we reach the start point of our comparison with experience. This covers the period 8,000 BCE to 4,000 BCE. To remind ourselves, this is the hypothesis we are testing. When the atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane increase, then this causes global average temperature to increase. During that 4,000 years of our first comparison, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels could be said to remain much the same, but had a slight negative trend, much as did nitrous oxide. Methane had a more significant decrease to 564 parts per billion, based on the greenhouse gas hypothesis. With the fall of all three gases, we should expect global average temperature to fall. But it did not. Global average temperature climbed throughout the 4,000 years. This finding was confirmed in the IPCC 1990 report where, referring to the present global average temperature, it is stated that a global warming of larger size has almost certainly occurred at least once since the end of the last glaciation, without any appreciable increase in greenhouse gases. The warming continued until global average temperature reached its warmest period, which lasted around 1,000 years. Within those 1,000 years, there was a 200-year-long interval that took place around 6,500 years ago, when GMST was between 0.3 and 1.8 degrees Celsius warmer than the 19th century, with a median value of 0.7 degrees Celsius. This was even though carbon dioxide levels appear to have been quite similar to those of the pre-industrial era at this time, 6,500 years ago. The global warming and greenhouse gas hypothesis has thus failed its first comparison with experience. Comparison with experience 2 covers the period 4000 BCE to 0 CE. And this period features the well-documented Holocene temperature conundrum. Carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration increased, nitrous oxide concentration increased, methane concentration increased, but global average temperature began a long-term fall. This fall was between minus 0.05 degrees Celsius and minus 0.24 degrees Celsius per 1,000 years, with a median of minus 0.08 degrees Celsius per 1,000 years. And the Kaufman study confirms that this cooling trend occurred while the atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases were increasing. The Kaufman study noted that a previous paper by Leo et al. Had coined the term Holocene temperature conundrum to highlight the contradiction between the cooling indicated by the proxy evidence versus the warming simulated by global climate models, which is still a trend reinforced in the most recent generation of climate models. We will return to this matter when we conclude. But for now, the hypothesis has again failed to agree with experience. Our third comparison to experience covers the period 0 to 1850. This period is often referred to by the IPCC when making comparisons with 20th and 21st century global average temperature. Carbon dioxide concentration was increasing, but was still at a relatively low value. Nitrous oxide concentration had a slight positive trend, while methane concentration increased significantly. But despite these increases in the greenhouse gas concentrations, global average temperature was cooling. It cooled at a rate of roughly minus 0.15 degrees Celsius per 1,000 years. At the end of this period, the cooling transitioned into the Little Ice Age, which the IPCC dates as 1450 to 1850. It is very interesting and pertinent to note just how cold this period was. If we look at the entire Holocene and plot back from the Little Ice Age. We see that according to the 5th percentile, it was cooler than the previous 10,000 years. For the median, it extended more than 10,000 years. The same for the 95th percentile. We determine, therefore, that the hypothesis fails the comparison with experience. But before finishing this period of comparison, one important point remains to be emphasized. The point had been noticed by the IPCC in its first 1990 report. The average carbon dioxide concentration at around 6,500 years ago, that's 4,500 BCE, the warmest 200 years of the Holocene, was 261 parts per million, while the average carbon dioxide concentration during the Little Ice Age, the coldest point of the past 10,000 years, was 280 parts per million. This comparison brings out another Holocene temperature conundrum. Carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration was roughly the same during the warmest period of the Holocene as it was during the coldest period of the past 10,000 years. This in itself must bring an objective person to doubt the validity of a hypothesis that ties the level of carbon dioxide to the level of global average temperature. Our next period of comparison is from 1850 to 1929, an inclusive total of 80 years. Carbon dioxide concentration was increasing throughout the 80 years. The nitrous oxide record for that time is quite sparse, but we can see that the concentration did increase. Methane concentration again increased substantially. But the modern recorded ADCRUT-5 data shows a downward trend for global average temperature. We can measure the decrease using the method definition provided by the IPCC. Global warming is defined as an increase in combined surface air and sea surface temperatures averaged over the globe and over a 30-year period. And it is expressed relative to the period 1850 to 1900. To provide insight, therefore, we will compare the reference period 1850 to 1900 with the 30-year period 1900 to 1929. The average temperature anomaly of 1850 to 1900 is minus 0.36 degrees Celsius. The average temperature anomaly of 1900 to 1929 is minus 0.38 degrees Celsius. Therefore, despite the increasing greenhouse gas concentrations, it is demonstrated that global average temperature was colder from 1900 to 1929 than it had been 1850 to 1900. The fall in global average temperature 1850 to 1929 is thus measured and confirmed. And to highlight the cold conditions of that period, a previous study by Marcotte et al. Emphasized that the decadal mean global temperature of the early 20th century, that is 1900 to 1909, was cooler than greater than 95% of the Holocene. But greenhouse gas concentrations were increasing. So again, the global warming and greenhouse gas hypothesis has failed the comparison with experience. Comparison to experience 5, 1930 to 1939. Carbon dioxide concentration increased. Nitrous oxide increased, although again we note the sparse record. Methane concentration increased, dipped, and again increased. And in line with the hypothesis, NOAA data shows an increase in global average temperature. So too does the ADCRUT-5 data. But there are caveats. The IPCC has noted that the rather rapid changes in global temperature seen around 1920 to 1940 are very likely to have had a mainly natural origin, and it is possible that some of the warming since the 19th century may just quite simply reflect the cessation of the Little Ice Age conditions. Despite the caveats for this 10-year period, the hypothesis does agree with experience. We now come to the 40-year period, 1940 to 1979. Carbon dioxide concentration increased from 310 parts per million to 335 parts per million. Nitrous oxide concentration increased. Methane concentration increased. According to the hypothesis, global average temperature should have increased. But according to the Hadkrut-5 data, it decreased. While the NOAA dataset over that period shows a negative trend of minus 0.01 degrees Celsius per decade. When compared to experience, the hypothesis is wrong. 1980 to 2014. Carbon dioxide concentration increased from 338 parts per million to 401 parts per million. Nitrous oxide concentration increased from 301 parts per billion to 326 parts per billion. Methane concentration increased from 1,656 parts per billion to 1,841 parts per billion. In line with the hypothesis, global average temperature also increased over that period, shown on both NOAA data and Hadkrut-5 data. Therefore, for this period, the hypothesis does agree with experience. Comparison number 8 is of the most recent 7-year period, 2015 to 2021. Carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration has continued to increase. Nitrous oxide concentration has increased. Methane concentration has increased. But global average temperature decreased at a rate of minus 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. This is confirmed by both NOAA and Hadkrut-5 datasets. And to bring the picture fully up to date, the very latest NOAA data for August 2022 shows the decrease continuing at a rate of minus 0.11 degrees Celsius per decade. The hypothesis again disagrees with experience. The initial analysis has finished. We can now discuss, analyse a little more and draw some conclusions. We are reviewing whether the global warming and greenhouse gas hypothesis withstands a comparison with experience, and what confidence should be placed in the hypothesis, and what confidence should be placed in the associated current climate models that are used for prediction. First, does the hypothesis agree with the experience of the past 10,000 years? Based on our analysis over the past 10,000 years, there has been a direct correlation between increases in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, and an increase in global average temperature for only 45 years, 1930 to 1939 and 1980 to 2014. The hypothesis quite markedly disagrees with experience. Thus, the first conclusion is the hypothesis does not agree with the experience of the past 10,000 years, therefore, it is wrong. Next, we discuss the Holocene temperature conundrum. This point is very important, and we go into further detail. The period from around 6,500 years ago, 4,500 BCE, to 1850 is a well-known problem for climate scientists and climate models. The increase in greenhouse gas concentrations over that period, together with the fall in global average temperature, invalidates the current climate models. We turn for a fuller explanation to the study of Leo et al. Referred to earlier. The study explained that a recent temperature reconstruction by Marcotte et al. Of global annual temperature shows early Holocene warmth followed by a cooling trend through the middle to late Holocene. This is the Marcotte data, which this channel has often used in past videos. It shows the downward trend in global average temperature from around 6,500 years ago. The study explains that this global cooling is puzzling because it is opposite from the expected and simulated global warming trend due to the retreating ice sheets and rising atmospheric greenhouse gases. It is the opposite to the hypothesis. The study analysed three climate models, CCSM3, FAMOUS and LOVE-CLIM. The three models all simulate a robust annual mean warming of approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius throughout the Holocene, as is shown here. The Leo study draws the logical and straightforward conclusion that if the Marcotte study is correct, then it will imply major biases across the current generation of climate models. It concludes, to provide a credible benchmark for future climate models, however, the proxy reconstructions will also need to be re-examined critically. Put another way, either the Marcotte study is wrong, or the climate models are wrong, or perhaps both are wrong. Therefore, the call for a new proxy study of the Holocene to weigh against the Marcotte study. Step forward, Kaufman et al., which is the new 2020 study we are using. As we have seen, however, it too quite clearly shows the decrease in global average temperature since 6,500 years ago. As a result, our second conclusion follows. The most recent climate models cannot account for the Holocene temperature conundrum. The models fail the comparison with experience. The models are therefore wrong and cannot be trusted. There is another feature of the Holocene temperature conundrum, which is just as powerful. The average carbon dioxide concentration at around 6,500 years ago, 4,500 BCE, the warmest 200 years of the Holocene, was 261 parts per million. The average carbon dioxide concentration during the Little Ice Age, the coldest point of the past 10,000 years, was 280 parts per million. Nitrous oxide concentration during the warm period was 259 parts per billion and 266 parts per billion during the cold period. Methane concentration during the warm period was 617 parts per billion and 702 parts per billion during the cold period. So, the concentration of each gas increased when global average temperature decreased. But in essence, it could be said the concentrations remained at relatively low levels and were pretty much the same during the warm period or during the cold period. This throws up a series of questions as to just what is the causal connection between greenhouse gases and global average temperature. This is just one question. The 2022 value for carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration is 418 parts per million. If that level is reduced through net zero actions to say 270 parts per million, what will be the result in global average temperature? The warmest time of the Holocene 6,500 years ago, when concentration was 262 parts per million, or the coldest time of the past 10,000 years, when it was 280 parts per million. Our third conclusion is this. The atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane were roughly the same during the warmest period of the Holocene as they were during the coldest period of the past 10,000 years. The hypothesis and climate models cannot explain this. How, therefore, can they be trusted to predict the future? That conclusion brings us directly to the last point of discussion, the irresponsible statements and actions made by the IPCC, World Economic Forum and United Nations. The evidence is irrefutable. The contents of this video demonstrates that the evidence is anything but irrefutable. This statement is irresponsible. The implementation of the 2030 agenda is being accelerated when it should be paused and urgently reviewed. The action of acceleration is irresponsible. Our final conclusion is that the IPCC, United Nations, World Economic Forum and associated governments are executing actions in an urgent, rushed manner that is causing social disruption and hardship. The hypothesis and the climate models upon which such actions are based have failed the comparison with experience and cannot be trusted. Our community combines the topics of globalism, nationalism, climate change, health, and the New World Order. If you would like to join our community, you can find us on locals.com/discover. Just enter the New World Order. This link will take you directly to our site.